Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Aurora and watched the alien ships approach through the darkness of space. 3 massive vessels moved toward Earth like silent giants, their hulls gleaming with strange lights that hurt his eyes to look at directly. After months of radio signals back and forth, first contact was finally happening near Jupiter's orbit, far enough from Earth to keep humanity safe if things went wrong. The alien ships were beautiful in a way that made Jake feel small and crude. His own ship, the Aurora, was humanity's best effort at a deep space vessel, built from steel and determination over 5 hard years. Next to these alien craft, it looked like a child's toy made from scrap metal. The approaching vessel seemed to bend light around them, their surfaces shifting like liquid mirror that reflected stars in impossible ways. Jake's communication officer, Lieutenant Amy Stone, looked up from her station with wide eyes. She had been the first human to successfully decode the alien language patterns 3 months ago. "Captain, they're requesting permission to come aboard," she said, her voice barely steady. "They want to meet face to face." The docking process took 2 hours. The aliens brought their own atmosphere bubble that attached to the Aurora's airlock like a soap bubble made of pure energy. Jake waited in the main conference room with his senior staff, trying not to let his nervousness show. Dr. Lisa Kane sat beside him, her notebook ready to record every detail of this historic moment. She had spent her whole career studying the possibility of alien life, never quite believing it would happen in her lifetime. The airlock opened with a sound like singing crystal. 3 figures walked through, and Jake's first thought was that they moved like dancers, each step flowing into the next with perfect grace. The lead alien was tall and thin, with skin that seemed to shift between blue and silver. Its eyes were large and dark, taking in everything with what felt like cold judgment. When it spoke, its voice came from a small device hanging around its neck, translating words into perfect English. "I am Ambassador Kextar of the Zilithian Empire," the alien said. "We represent the Galactic Coalition, a union of 47 advanced civilizations. We have come to evaluate your species for possible membership." Jake stood and offered his hand, a gesture he immediately regretted when Kextar looked at it with obvious distaste. "I'm Captain Jake Morrison, representing Earth and humanity. We're honored by your visit." Kextar ignored the offered hand and moved to the conference table, its companions following in perfect formation. They sat with movements so smooth they seemed to flow like water. "Your species has barely mastered nuclear fusion," Kextar said without any introduction or pleasantries. "Your planet shows signs of constant warfare over resources that are abundant throughout the galaxy. Your technology is primitive by any reasonable standard." Dr. Kane leaned forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her caution. "We've achieved spaceflight and radio communication. We've begun to understand our place in the universe." One of Kextar's companions made a sound that the translator rendered as laughter, but it felt cold and cutting. "You have barely left your home system," Kextar replied. "Your fastest ships would take thousands of years to reach the nearest coalition world. Your understanding of physics is limited to the most basic principles." The meeting continued for 3 hours. Kextar and his companions asked questions about human society, technology, and culture. Each answer seemed to disappoint them more. When Jake explained how humans had survived ice ages and plagues through cooperation and determination, Kextar simply nodded, as if confirming something unpleasant. When Dr. Kane described humanity's scientific achievements, the aliens exchanged what could only be looks of pity. Finally, Kextar announced the Coalition's decision. "We will offer your species junior membership status," he said, the words feeling like a slap. "You will be assigned to mining operations in remote asteroid fields. You will not have access to advanced technologies until you prove yourselves capable of proper civilization. Perhaps in a few thousand years, you might develop beyond your current primitive state." After the aliens left, Jake and his crew sat in stunned silence. Amy Stone was the first to speak. "They looked at us like we were insects," she said quietly, "like we were barely worth their time." Dr. Kane was studying her notes, but her hands were shaking slightly. "There's something they're not telling us," she said. I noticed gaps in their historical records. They mentioned 47 civilizations in the coalition, but their data suggests there used to be more, much more. Jake walked to the window and looked out at the alien ships now preparing to leave. Junior membership, he said bitterly. Mining asteroids for our betters. But even as disappointment filled the room, something else was stirring in the human crew. Tony Rodriguez, the Aurora's chief mechanic, had been studying the energy readings from the alien ships during their visit. "Captain," he said slowly, "their technology is impressive, but it's not magic. I'm seeing patterns here, ways their systems work that we might be able to understand and improve on." Amy Stone nodded. "Their translation device had trouble with some of our concepts," she added, "especially when we talked about improvisation and adaptation. It's like those ideas don't exist in their language." Dr. Kane looked up from her notes with a thoughtful expression. "Maybe being primitive isn't the weakness they think it is," she said quietly. "Maybe it means we still have something they've lost." Jake felt a spark of something that wasn't quite hope but wasn't despair either. Humanity had been judged and found wanting by beings who saw themselves as the peak of evolution. But humans had been underestimated before by their own species, and by nature itself. They had survived ice and fire, plague and war, not because they were the strongest or the smartest, but because they refused to give up. The alien ships disappeared into the void, leaving humanity with an offer that felt more like an insult and a future that looked like servitude. But as Jake looked around at his crew, he saw something the aliens had missed. He saw the spark that had carried humanity from caves to stars, the stubborn refusal to accept limits that others tried to place on them. They called humans primitive, but they had never seen what primitives could do when they decided to prove everyone wrong. The galaxy was about to learn that lesson, though none of them knew it yet. 3 years had passed since humanity joined the Galactic Coalition as junior members, and Colonel Beth Parker was getting tired of being treated like a child. She stood in the briefing room aboard the Coalition station Nexus Prime, listening to Admiral Theknox explain their latest patrol assignment with the kind of voice adults used when talking to slow students. "Your human unit will accompany our forces to the Outer Rim," the tall, gray-skinned admiral said, his 4 eyes blinking. "In sequence. This is a routine mission to investigate missing cargo ships. You will observe and learn proper military procedures." Beth kept her face neutral, but inside she was burning. Her Marines were some of Earth's finest soldiers, veterans who had seen combat across 3 continents before joining the space program. The Coalition treated them like curious pets who might bite if not handled carefully. The patrol consisted of 3 Coalition cruisers and Beth's ship, the Defiance, which the aliens considered barely functional. Commander Rick Stone piloted their vessel with the easy confidence of someone who had flown everything from fighter jets to orbital shuttles. His crew was small but experienced, each person cross-trained in multiple systems because humans couldn't afford the luxury of specialists. The journey to the Outer Rim took 5 days. Beth used the time to study Coalition military records, searching for patterns in their tactics. What she found surprised her. The Coalition had not fought a real war in over 2,000 years. Their military was more like a police force, designed to handle pirates and smugglers, not serious threats. Their strategies were elegant and efficient, but they followed rigid patterns that never seemed to change. On Earth, Beth had studied military history from ancient Rome to modern conflicts. She understood that war was chaos, that plans survived only until the first shot was fired. The Coalition seemed to believe that superior technology could eliminate uncertainty from combat, that every battle could be won by following the proper procedures. The patrol reached the last known position of the missing cargo ships on a Tuesday. The area looked empty, just stars and darkness stretching in all directions. The Coalition ships spread out in a perfect formation, their sensors sweeping space in predetermined patterns. Beth watched from the Defiance's bridge as the alien vessels moved like clockwork, each ship following its assigned role with mechanical precision. Then everything went wrong at once. The attack came without warning. Ships appeared from nowhere, their hulls black as space itself and covered in strange symbols that seemed to move when you looked at them directly. They used weapons that Beth had never seen before, beams of energy that passed right through Coalition shields and tore into their hulls like paper. The first Coalition cruiser, the Harmony, died in seconds. Its shields flickered once and failed completely. Then something tore through its center and the ship broke apart in a shower of metal and air. The other two Coalition vessels immediately followed their standard defensive protocols, forming up and attempting to retreat while calling for backup. The unknown attackers moved like predators, fast and deadly. They seemed to know exactly what the Coalition ships would do, cutting off their retreat and herding them like sheep. Beth watched in horror as the second cruiser, the Unity, suffered the same fate as the first. Its crew had maybe 30 seconds to realize they were dying. Rick Stone was already moving before Beth gave the order. The Defiance dropped out of formation and dove toward the planet below, using its gravity well to build speed and change direction. The attacking ships turned to follow, but Rick was flying like a man possessed, pulling maneuvers that would have killed anyone not strapped down tight. "Those aren't standard attack patterns," Beth said, studying the enemy movement on her tactical display. "They're hunting, like a pack of wolves." The Coalition doctrine called for orderly retreat and regrouping, but Rick threw the Defiance into a wild spiral that brought them around behind the attackers. Beth's weapons officer, Sergeant Dan Miller, locked onto the nearest enemy ship and fired everything they had. Human missiles, primitive by Coalition standards, punched through whatever shielding the attackers used and exploded against their hulls. The enemy ships seemed surprised. They had torn through Coalition defenses like they weren't there, but human weapons actually hurt them. One of the black ships broke off its attack on the remaining Coalition cruiser and came after the Defiance with what looked like anger. Rick Stone grinned and pushed their engines past safe limits. "Let's see how these things handle a little chaos," he said, throwing the ship into a series of random maneuvers that had no pattern or logic. The enemy ship tried to follow, but its movements were too predictable, too perfect. Rick stayed one step ahead by doing things that made no sense, turning when logic said to go straight, diving when tactics demanded climbing. Beth realized something important as she watched the battle unfold. The attackers were incredibly advanced, but they fought like machines following programs that could be understood and predicted. Humans fought like humans, messy and unpredictable, and absolutely refusing to follow the rules. The last Coalition cruiser, the Progress, was badly damaged, but still fighting. Its captain, a veteran named Zephyros, was one of the few aliens who had shown respect for human capabilities. She had been watching the Defiance's wild maneuvers and seemed to understand what Rick was doing. Her ship broke formation and began copying human tactics, moving in sudden bursts and direction changes that confused the attackers. Together, the two ships managed to destroy 3 of the enemy vessels and drive off the rest. But the cost was terrible. 2 Coalition cruisers were gone, taking their crews with them. The Progress was barely functional, held together by emergency force fields and desperate repairs. In the aftermath, as rescue ships arrived from Coalition, Space Beth found herself in the strange position of giving a tactical briefing to Admiral Theknox. The alien commander listened with all 4 eyes focused on her, his earlier condescension replaced by something like respect. "Your analysis, Colonel Parker," he said formally. Beth called up her tactical display and pointed to the battle recordings. "These weren't pirates or raiders," she said. "This was a military force using technology we don't understand. They knew exactly how Coalition ships would respond to attack, like they had studied your tactics for years. But they didn't know how to handle human unpredictability." Captain Zephyros, her ship's hull still glowing from emergency repairs, nodded slowly. "I have fought beside many Coalition species," she said. "All of them follow logical patterns, efficient strategies. But efficiency can become a weakness when facing an enemy who understands your logic." Meanwhile, back at Coalition headquarters, Dr. Andy Chen was having his own revelations. The young scientist had been working in the Coalition's vast archives for 2 years, and he was starting to notice troubling patterns in the historical records. Civilizations that had once been part of the Coalition were simply gone, their entries marked as relocated or evolved beyond physical existence. But Andy had found fragments of older records, files that seemed to have been deliberately damaged or hidden. They spoke of something called the Devourers, entities that came from the space between galaxies to consume entire civilizations. The records were ancient and incomplete, but they described attacks that sounded exactly like what Beth Parker had encountered in the Outer Rim. When Andy tried to present his findings to the Coalition Science Council, they dismissed his research with the same patronizing attitude that all humans had learned to expect. "Your species has a tendency toward paranoid thinking," Council Leader Vex Thalon told him. "You see threats where none exist because your evolution was shaped by constant danger. We have moved beyond such primitive fears." But Andy kept digging, and what he found in the deepest archives made his blood run cold. The galaxy had been much more crowded once, filled with thousands of species rather, than the current 47. And every civilization that had vanished had been marked in the records as primitive or unworthy, just like humanity. Something was coming for the Coalition, something that had been asleep for thousands of years, and the only warning signs were being ignored because they came from species that the advanced civilizations considered too primitive to understand real danger. The first star system died on a Monday. The Kelvari system, home to 12 billion souls and 3 thriving worlds, simply went dark. Communication arrays that had broadcast across the galaxy for centuries fell silent in the space of an hour. Long-range sensors showed nothing where the system used to be, not even the star itself, just empty space that seemed to swallow light. Admiral Kate Sullivan received the report while reviewing fleet deployments aboard Earth's newest command ship, the Endeavour. In the 5 years since first contact, humanity had built a small but growing space force, mostly by taking Coalition hand-me-downs and making them work better through human stubbornness and mechanical intuition. Kate had commanded destroyers in Earth's oceans before taking to space, and she understood that the galaxy was becoming a more dangerous place. The Coalition High Council called an emergency session within hours of losing contact with the Kelvari system. Kate attended as Earth's representative, sitting in the junior members section alongside delegates from other species that the Coalition considered backward. She watched as the great minds of galactic civilization tried to explain away what had happened with calm, logical theories about stellar collapse or dimensional rifts. Ambassador Kextar, the same Zelithian who had first judged humanity as primitive, stood before the assembly with his usual air of superiority. "The Kelvari system has experienced some form of natural disaster," he announced. "Our scientists believe it may have been a rare but predictable stellar phenomenon. We are dispatching investigation teams to study the aftermath." But the investigation teams never made it to their destination. 3 more systems went dark while the ships were in transit, their positions marked only by spreading zones of absolute darkness that seemed to consume everything they touched. The Coalition's most advanced sensors could detect nothing within these dead zones, as if space itself had been erased. Dr. Andy Chen watched the reports from his station in the archives, and his worst fears began to take shape. The ancient records he had been studying suddenly made terrible sense. The entities they called devourers were not just myth or legend, they were real, and they had returned after 10,000 years of sleep. The galaxy's expansion into new regions had awakened something that should have stayed buried in the darkness between stars. Andy tried again to warn the Coalition leadership, presenting his research to anyone who would listen. The response was always the same polite dismissal. "Your species has a tendency to see patterns where none exist," they told him. "These are natural phenomena that will be explained by proper scientific analysis." Meanwhile, the dying continued. Entire sectors fell silent as the darkness spread, and the few ships that escaped the expanding dead zones brought stories that the Coalition refused to believe. They spoke of massive entities that existed in the void between dimensions, creatures that devoured not just matter and energy, but consciousness itself. The survivors described watching their comrades simply stop existing, not killed but erased, from reality as if they had never been born. Coalition forces, despite their advanced technology, proved utterly helpless against these attacks. Their most powerful weapons passed through the devourers without effect. Their sophisticated artificial intelligence systems shut down in apparent terror when they tried to analyze the entities. Ships that had dominated the galaxy for millennia were swept aside like dust before a hurricane. The breaking point came when the devourers reached the Zelithian home system. Kate Sullivan was in a strategy meeting with coalition commanders when the reports started coming in. The most advanced civilization in the galaxy, the species that had looked down on humanity as barely evolved animals, was screaming for help across every communication channel. "They're in our sun," came the desperate transmission from Zilithian Prime. "They're eating our star from the inside out. Our weapons do nothing, our shields are useless. They're coming for our minds, they're coming for our thoughts. Please, anyone who can hear this, help us." The transmission cut to static. Within hours, the Zilithian system joined the growing network of dead space that was spreading across the galaxy like an infection. The Coalition's most arrogant members were gone, consumed by the very forces they had refused to acknowledge. It was then that the Coalition High Council did something unprecedented. They sent a direct communication to Earth, not to the junior member section, but to Admiral Sullivan personally. The message was simple and desperate. "We need your help." Kate found herself standing before the same assembly that had once dismissed humanity as primitive children. But now the Great Hall was half empty, dozens of seats vacant where representatives of dead civilizations once sat. The remaining council members looked at her with something that might have been hope, or might have been desperation. Council leader Vexthalon, his usual composure cracked by fear, spoke with a voice that shook. "Admiral Sullivan, we have reconsidered our assessment of your species' capabilities. We formally request that humanity take a leading role in our defense against these entities." Kate looked around the chamber at beings who had spent years treating humans like barely intelligent pets. "What changed your minds?" she asked quietly. "Your ships," admitted Admiral Thekanox, the same officer who had once lectured Colonel Parker about proper military procedures. "Human vessels are the only ones that have successfully engaged these entities and survived. Your weapons actually damage them. Your crews think in ways that confuse and frustrate their attacks." Engineer Sam Mitchell had been working around the clock to understand why human technology was effective against the Devourers when Coalition science failed completely. His breakthrough came from studying brain scans of human crews who had survived encounters with the entities. Human consciousness, shaped by millions of years of evolution in a dangerous universe, operated on quantum frequencies that the Devourers could not process or consume. "It's not about our technology," Sam explained to the assembled scientists and military leaders. "It's about how we think. The Devourers feed on ordered consciousness, on minds that work in predictable patterns. But human thinking is chaotic, creative, shaped by survival instincts that never got programmed out of us." Dr. Grace Thompson, working alongside coalition researchers who finally treated her as an equal rather than a curiosity, developed the first effective weapons against the Devourers. The devices channeled human thought patterns into destructive energy waves, turning humanity's supposedly primitive neural chaos into a weapon that could actually hurt entities from beyond normal space. As reports continued to arrive from the spreading dead zones, Kate realized that the Coalition was looking to humanity, not as junior partners but as their only hope for survival. The species that had called humans primitive now understood that primitive meant something else entirely. It meant unbroken by comfort, unsoftened by centuries of peace, still carrying the spark of wildness that had carried them from caves to stars. The Devourers had returned to reclaim a galaxy they considered theirs by right. They had faced advanced civilizations before and consumed them all, but they had never encountered a species like humanity, one that had been forged in conflict and still remembered how to fight for survival. The ancient entities were about to learn that evolution and advancement were not the same thing, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemy was the one everyone else had underestimated. Kate looked out at the Coalition representatives, seeing fear in their eyes but also something like understanding. "We'll help you," she said simply, "but we do this our way, with our methods and our thinking. No more junior partnerships, no more being told we're too primitive to understand. If you want human help, you get human leadership." The vote was unanimous. For the first time in galactic history, a species that had been considered barely civilized was given command of the Coalition's military forces. The galaxy's survival now rested in the hands of the primitives, and Kate Sullivan intended to show The Devourers, exactly what humans could do when they decided to stop playing nice. General Alex Rodriguez stood before the largest war council in galactic history, looking out at representatives from 43 surviving civilizations. The number got smaller each day as more systems fell to the Devourers, but the remaining species had finally learned to listen when humans spoke. The great chamber buzzed with translation devices working in dozens of languages, but everyone understood the stakes without needing words. "The Devourers are not invaders," Alex said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "They're the original owners of this galaxy, and they've come home to find it infested with what they consider parasites. Every advanced civilization, every great achievement of the Coalition, they see it all as contamination that needs to be cleaned away." Dr. Elena Foster had spent months studying the fragments of ancient records that Andy Chen had uncovered, piecing together a history that the Coalition had either forgotten or deliberately hidden. Her research revealed a terrifying truth about the galaxy's past. "The species we call primitive," she explained to the Council, "were actually the galaxy's natural defenders. They carried genetic and mental patterns that could resist Devourer influence. The Coalition eliminated them not because they were backward, but because their potential threatened the established order." Captain Nina Bell was preparing for what everyone knew would be a suicide mission. Her ship, the Resilience, had been equipped with the most advanced human Devourer hybrid weapons that Dr. Grace Thompson could design. The plan was simple in concept, but nearly impossible in execution. Nina would lead a small fleet into the heart of Devourer territory, into the dead zones where reality itself had been twisted beyond recognition. "The mission has 3 objectives," Admiral Kate Sullivan explained to the assembled crews. "First, we need to map the Devourer strongholds and understand how they're spreading. Second, we need to test our new weapons under actual combat conditions. Third, we need to send a message that this galaxy will not surrender without a fight." The volunteers came from every surviving species, but the core crews were human. Not because the Coalition species lacked courage, but because human neural patterns were the only ones that could function in the reality-warped space around Devourer concentrations. Coalition crew members who entered those zones simply stopped thinking, their ordered minds unable to process the chaos that the Devourers brought with them. Nina's fleet consisted of 12 ships, a mix of human vessels and Coalition craft retrofitted, with human-designed systems. Commander Rick Stone piloted one of the escort ships, his experience from previous Devourer encounters making him invaluable for the mission. They launched from Nexus Prime with the prayers and hopes of 43 civilizations behind them. The journey into Devourer territory took 6 days, and each day brought them deeper into regions where the normal laws of physics began to break down. Space itself seemed to ripple around them, and stars appeared and disappeared without warning. Coalition crew members had to be sedated after the 3rd day, their minds unable to cope with the illogical nature of their surroundings. But the humans adapted. They had always lived in a universe that didn't make sense, where survival depended on accepting chaos and finding ways to thrive within it. Tony Rodriguez, now chief engineer of the entire human fleet, worked constantly to keep their ships functioning, as reality shifted around them. "It's like flying through a fever dream," he reported to Nina. "But we've had nightmares before." The first Devourer stronghold they encountered defied description. It existed in multiple dimensions at once, a structure that was simultaneously vast and tiny, ancient and newly formed. Ships that approached it simply vanished, not destroyed but edited out of existence as if they had never been built. Nina ordered her fleet to maintain maximum distance while their sensors tried to make sense of what they were seeing. "It's not just a base," reported Dr. Andy Chen, who had insisted on joining the mission despite the dangers. "It's a nursery. They're breeding more of themselves, preparing for a final assault on what's left of Coalition space." The battle that followed changed everything. Human weapons, powered by chaotic thought patterns and unpredictable creativity, tore into Devourer defenses that had been impregnable to Coalition forces. The entities that emerged to fight them were creatures of pure nightmare, existing partially outside normal space and time. But humans had been dealing with nightmares their entire evolutionary history. Nina's tactical approach was everything the Coalition had been trained to avoid. She split her forces randomly, attacked from impossible angles, and used strategies that made no logical sense. The Devourers, creatures of ancient order and cosmic law, found themselves facing an enemy that refused to follow any rules they understood. "They keep trying to predict our movements," Commander Stone reported during the battle, "but we're not following any pattern they can analyze. Every time they think they understand what we're doing, we do something completely different." Humans lost 4 ships in the engagement, but they achieved something unprecedented. They actually drove the Devourers back, forcing the entities to retreat deeper into their stronghold. More importantly, they had proven that the ancient cosmic horrors were not invincible. Back in Coalition space, the tide of war began to shift. General Rodriguez coordinated the defense of the remaining core worlds using strategies that would have horrified Coalition military theorists just months earlier. Instead of elegant formations and logical deployments, human forces struck in chaotic swarms, appearing where the Devourers least expected them and vanishing before the entities could respond effectively. The Coalition's most advanced civilizations watched in amazement as human tactics repeatedly outmaneuvered enemies that had consumed entire stellar empires. Species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of logical warfare found themselves learning from primitives who fought like wild animals and somehow kept winning. Dr. Elena Foster made another crucial discovery while studying captured Devourer technology. The entities were not just randomly destroying civilizations. They were specifically targeting species that had lost their connection to what she called primal consciousness. The more advanced and orderly a civilization became, the easier it was for the Devourers to consume. "It's like they're performing cosmic surgery," she explained to the War Council. "They're cutting away everything that has become too organized, too predictable. The species they're leaving alive are the ones that still have chaos in their thinking patterns." This revelation led to a desperate program where Coalition scientists tried to reintroduce randomness and creativity into their species' thought processes. It was partially successful, but the results came too slowly. Most Coalition races had spent thousands of years breeding chaos out of their genetics and cultures. Only a few individuals could successfully adapt human-style thinking patterns. Meanwhile, Captain Zephyros had become one of humanity's strongest advocates within the Coalition military structure. Her ship, the Progress, now carried a mixed crew of humans and Coalition members, and she had learned to fight using human tactical principles. "Logic is a luxury for peacetime," she told her officers. "In war, survival belongs to those who can adapt fastest to changing conditions." The Coalition's remaining worlds began to implement emergency protocols based on human organizational principles. Instead of rigid hierarchies, they adopted flexible command structures. Instead of predetermined response patterns, they trained their forces to improvise and adapt. It was chaotic and inefficient by their old standards, but it worked against an enemy that fed on order and predictability. As the war entered its most desperate phase, humanity found itself in a position no one could have imagined 5 years earlier. They were not just participants in the galaxy's defense, they were its leaders and teachers. Species that had once looked down on human primitiveness now sent their brightest minds to study at human military academies, learning the arts of chaos and creative destruction. The galaxy was fighting for its life, and its best hope lay in embracing the very qualities that advanced civilizations had spent millennia trying to eliminate. Humanity had been called primitive because they never forgot how to be wild, how to fight without rules, how to find hope in hopeless situations. Now, those primitive qualities were all that stood between the galaxy and complete annihilation by forces older than civilization itself. The final battle began at the galaxy's core, where the Devourers had built their ultimate stronghold around the supermassive black hole that held billions of stars in their dance. Admiral Kate Sullivan commanded a united fleet of every surviving warship in Coalition space, human vessels flying alongside alien craft in formations that would have seemed impossible years earlier. The enemy had come to consume the galaxy's central consciousness nexus, the quantum field that connected all thinking minds across hundreds of thousands of light years. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of humanity's flagship, the Liberty, watching as space itself writhed around the Devourer construct. The ancient entities had wrapped their stronghold around the galactic core like a cancer, feeding on the fundamental forces that held reality together. If they succeeded in consuming the Nexus, every thinking being in the galaxy would simply stop existing, their consciousness absorbed into the collective hunger of creatures older than stars. The Devourers had learned from their previous encounters with human forces. Their defenses were no longer the orderly structures that human chaos could easily disrupt. Instead, they had created weapons of pure entropy, fields of anti-thought that could unmake any mind that approached them. Coalition ships that entered these zones simply drifted dead in space, their crews erased from existence without even the dignity of death. Dr. Lisa Kane worked frantically in the Liberty's medical bay, studying brain scans from the few survivors of Devourer attacks. She had discovered something crucial about the entity's feeding process. They didn't just consume consciousness, they required it to be organized and predictable. Human minds, with their chaotic mix of logic and emotion, instinct and creativity, were like poison to the Devourer's digestive processes. "We need to get closer," Jake told Kate over the communication link. "The weapons Dr. Thompson designed need direct contact with their core structure to be effective, but every ship that approaches those anti-thought fields gets wiped clean." Kate studied the tactical display, watching as wave after wave of Coalition vessels tried and failed to breach the Devourer defenses. The alien ships were brave and their crews were willing to die for their homes, but bravery wasn't enough against an enemy that could erase you from reality itself. "What about our volunteer crews?" she asked. The volunteer crews were the most desperate gamble in galactic history. Dr. Grace Thompson had developed a process that could temporarily randomize neural patterns, making even Coalition minds temporarily chaotic enough to resist Devourer influence. The process was dangerous and often fatal, but hundreds of alien volunteers had submitted to it, knowing that their sacrifice might save their species. Commander Rick Stone piloted one of the volunteer ships, his crew a mix of humans and Coalition members who had undergone the neural randomization process. His co-pilot was Lieutenant Zara Voss, a Zilithian who had survived the destruction of her homeworld and volunteered for the most dangerous mission in the fleet. The randomization had left her partially insane by her species' standards, but it had also made her mind unreadable to the Devourers. "All ships, this is Admiral Sullivan," Kate's voice carried across the fleet. "We're going to hit them with everything we have all at once. No formations, no coordinated attacks. Every ship chooses its own approach and its own target. Make chaos. Make noise, make them think we're everywhere at once." The assault was beautiful in its complete lack of order. Human ships dove straight at the Devourer stronghold while Coalition vessels approached from impossible angles. Some ships attacked in perfect formation, while others spun wildly through space, their movements following no pattern that ancient minds could predict. The Devourer's defenses, designed to counter logical military strategies, found themselves facing tactical chaos that defied analysis. Jake Morrison led his ship through the outer defensive fields, feeling the Liberty shake as anti-thought weapons tried to erase his crew from existence. But human consciousness, shaped by millions of years of surviving in an irrational universe, proved remarkably resistant to being logically deleted. The crew felt their minds stretching and bending under the assault, but they held together through sheer stubborn refusal to stop existing. Dr. Andy Chen, monitoring the battle from the fleet's mobile command center, watched as his theories about consciousness and chaos proved themselves in the most violent laboratory imaginable. "The Devourers are faltering," he reported to Admiral Sullivan. "They're designed to consume ordered thought, but we're feeding them pure randomness. It's like trying to digest static." The breakthrough came when Captain Nina Bell's ship, the Resilience, managed to breach the innermost defenses through a maneuver that violated several laws of physics and all known principles of military strategy. She had ordered her crew to think about everything except their mission, filling their minds with random memories and emotional chaos, while her ship's computers navigated by pure chance. "I'm inside their core structure," Nina reported, her voice crackling with interference from the reality distortions around her. "It's like being inside the digestive system of a god, but the weapons are working. The human-designed particle beams are actually cutting through their central matrix." Other ships followed Nina's lead, each crew finding their own insane path through the Devourer defenses. Tony Rodriguez, now commanding his own vessel, brought his ship through by having his crew sing Old Earth songs while his engines played jazz music through their quantum resonance chambers. Commander Stone arrived by flying backwards while his randomized crew told jokes in languages that didn't exist. The final moment came when Dr. Lisa Kane made her ultimate sacrifice. She had been working on a theoretical weapon based on human consciousness patterns, a device that could broadcast pure chaotic thought across space. The weapon required a living, human mind to power it, and that mind would be consumed in the process. "I've spent my whole career studying the possibility of alien life," Lisa said over the communication link as she prepared to activate her device. "I never imagined I'd die proving that humans are the aliens the galaxy needed." The consciousness bomb, as historians would later call it, exploded outward from Lisa's position in a wave of pure human thought. It carried with it every chaotic impulse, every creative leap, every stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had ever existed in a human mind. The Devourers, entities of cosmic order and ancient law, found themselves drowning in an ocean of beautiful, impossible, utterly human randomness. The ancient stronghold began to collapse as its inhabitants retreated deeper into the spaces between dimensions. Jake Morrison watched through tears as the construct that had threatened to consume all conscious life simply folded in on itself and disappeared. The Devourers were not destroyed, but they were beaten, driven back to the dark spaces where they belonged. In the aftermath, as rescue ships moved through the battlefield and the galaxy slowly came to terms with its survival, Admiral Kate Sullivan found herself facing a transformed universe. The Coalition still existed, but it was no longer the rigid hierarchy of advanced civilizations looking down on primitive species. The war had taught everyone that advancement and evolution were not the same thing, that sometimes the most sophisticated response to a problem was to embrace chaos and fight like wild animals. Ambassador Kextar, one of the few Zilithians to survive his species' destruction, approached Kate with a formal apology that would have seemed impossible years earlier. "We called your species primitive because we feared your potential," he said, his translator rendering his words with something that sounded like shame. "We never understood that you weren't behind us in evolution. You were ahead of us, keeping alive the qualities that we had bred out of ourselves." The galaxy began to restructure itself around human principles of adaptability, creativity, and controlled chaos. Earth ships patrolled the borders not as the Coalition's junior partners, but as its guardians, watching for threats that ordered minds might miss. Humanity had found its place among the stars not as subjects or servants, but as protectors of all thinking beings. Jake Morrison, now promoted to admiral and tasked with establishing humanity's new role in galactic affairs, often found himself thinking about that first meeting with the aliens years ago. They had judged humans as primitive, based on their technology and their tendency toward conflict. They had never understood that being primitive meant being unbroken by comfort, unsoftened by safety, still carrying the spark that had lifted humanity from caves to stars. They thought primitive meant weak, Jake told the graduating class of the first integrated military academy, where human and alien cadets learned together to fight without rules and think without limits. They never realized that primitive means pure, means keeping alive the things that matter when everything else falls apart. The Devourers still existed somewhere in the darkness between galaxies, ancient and patient, and waiting for another chance to reclaim what they considered theirs. But when they returned, if they returned, they would face not just the advanced civilizations of the Coalition but the indomitable spirit of humanity, the species that had been dismissed as primitive, but proved to be exactly what the galaxy needed when the darkness came calling.